Most of you know Renée, but I'm going to say a few words about her for those of you who don't. Renée founded the Still and Moving Center 10 years ago. And in part, she says, and you can find this on the website as well, based on her experience as a lifetime board member of the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara, and her love for and convictions about the many benefits, spiritual, psychological, and physical, related to the practices of mindful movement. She's an extremely talented dance and movement instructor, as evidenced by her NIA black belt and her certification as a teacher instructor. And you could say it's both her love for dance and for humanity that inspired her to found the Still and Moving Center. And having known Renée for over 40 years, I can say with complete conviction that she's not only a lifelong devoted and deeply intuitive spiritual seeker, a student and advocate for all the world's wisdom traditions, but also a genuine friend to all, known for both her own motherly compassion, as well as clarity and precision and depth of thought and insight. So Renée will present for approximately 20 minutes or so, and then the remainder of the hour will be open for questions and discussion. So Renée Tillotson.
Thank you so much, both of you. And I'm so glad to have all of you here to join in our conversation on the topic of whether everything's alive, under the idea of life atoms. This is a term that was used by a woman named Helena Blavatsky in the 1800s, who is the person who presented to the world this collective body of insight known as Theosophy, which she garnered as she traveled the world. She circled the world about 2.5 times by herself in the 1800s as a single woman. And she went to different spiritual centers around the world, and she was always looking to find the common threads in all these different spiritual traditions, philosophical traditions. And she was very much interested in all of the science of the time, even though a lot of what she said kind of went beyond the science of her age and is more speaking actually to the science of our age. And she uses a lot of other terms as well that that kind of equate with that term. So when I think about everything that I've learned through science and the idea of evolution, and watching how little single cell creatures become more complex, and we see them go through the plant kingdom, then they become more complex, and we see the animal kingdom evolve. It becomes more complex, more sophisticated, more self-moving, more self-directed. I can see an evolutionary pattern, a flow. We have this distinction that we make in modern Western culture between what we call animate and inanimate, or organic and inorganic matter. And I guess it didn't quite make sense to me for a long time, from the standpoint that, well, okay, we know that the plants are taking up minerals and so on from the soil, right? And then the animals are eating the plants, and we're either eating the animals or we're eating the plants and the animals. And we must be taking in these minerals into ourselves. And that's called inanimate matter, but I'm bringing it into my body. It's becoming part of my whole life process. How could that not be part of life? How could it be considered inanimate or not evolving? And so when I encountered some of the theosophical ideas, I began to see, my questions about this get some answers that made more sense to me. And Theosophy does say, yes, everything is alive. And not only that, everything is on an evolutionary path. Helena Blavatsky says life is ever present in atoms or matter, whether called organic or inorganic. And she talks about vast periods of evolution and vast periods of manifestation. So the whole cosmos goes through these periodic cycles of coming into manifestation, having things in itself in form, and then withdrawing and passing out of manifestation. And this cycle, this breathing out and breathing back in, goes on eternally. And by the same token, evidently everything else, or everything within the cosmos, is also coming into being and then withdrawing from being, and then coming into being and withdrawing from being. Just like our cycle of sleep and waking and going back into sleep and waking. Something like that is happening in terms of life and lifetimes. So when she talks about this coming into being, she talks about coming out of this unmanifest state, like deep dreamless sleep of the cosmos. And then as the cosmos wakes up, it comes into being. We get this sense of maybe from darkness, light coming and creating a cosmos. And eventually, this takes a long time or a lot of differentiation, it could be called, going from this one absolute and then manifesting into all the things in the world. I think the Chinese call it the world of the 10,000 things, to represent who knows how many quadrillion, gazillion things are in the world when the world is manifest. We could think of that vast array of somethings that are in the manifest world as life atoms. That would be one term that we could use. And all of those life atoms, I love that word life atoms, because they're not little things, not like little particles. They're breaths, they're sparks. They're like shafts of light from the unmanifest. And all of these life atoms are traveling on this evolutionary journey. I'll just mention this one thing. I don't know whether we'll need to get to it, but she talks about from the unmanifest to the manifest as being a sliding scale. You could consider the unmanifest, you could use the word spirit, and the manifest, you could use the word matter. So evolution is matter learning, evolving, climbing its way up out of matter, which is relatively asleep, slumbering, but has the possibility of being very awake and conscious. So evolution would be that waking up and rising up into more and more consciousness. And involution would be spirit coming down into matter and informing it. So this two directional kind of process taking place of the more conscious coming into matter that's slumbering, and matter that's slumbering coming up and becoming more aware, more conscious. As these life atoms go through their evolutionary journey, they pass through all these different phases, all these different stages that allow different learning experiences, I guess we would call it. I guess one would learn something different if one were in the body of a snail versus if one were in the body of a octopus versus in an orangutan versus in a human being versus in some really highly evolved human being. These are just different stages of the learning process. And just the same as if we looked at a person in a little body who was in preschool learning to stack up blocks, we wouldn't think any less of them that they weren't yet in graduate school learning to do, astrophysics. They're just not at that stage yet, right? So there's nothing lesser than, or really anything greater than. It's just all these different stages. Although it can be said that beings that are at a stage that's already gone through those other stages would have something to impart, to teach to beings who haven't gone through those later stages yet. Right? So the question that really interests me is that this idea that, let's just talk about the physical being that I'm in, let alone, okay, I also have a personality and I have a mind, I have an emotional nature, I have a mental nature, and so on. Even just minimally thinking of this physical body that I'm living in, it's made up of all these life atoms that are going through their evolutionary process, right? And so is everybody else's body. And all of these life atoms, one thing that she was so prescient about, so ahead of her time, is not this Helena Blavatsky I'm talking about, not thinking of these as things, just, having so much more subtle conception of what life atoms might be. And she understood that everything was vibration. Nothing was a thing. Everything's vibration. And so she talked about the importance of number and color and sound, like frequencies, just like the electromagnetic spectrum. Everything's along these different frequencies. And we know, for example, from science that when we get, I think it's within 8 feet of another human being, our heartbeats start to get in sync with one another. we know from any study of psychology that the way that we interact with one another has a huge effect on that other person, right? It causes them stress, or it settles them. It makes them feel warm. It makes them feel scared. You know, we have so many effects upon one another. What is our effect on all these little life atoms that make up our physical vestures? What is our effect on the life atoms of the people around us? What's the effect that I make through whatever vibratory rate I'm holding, depending on whether I'm, you know, in a fairly decent state of consciousness versus when I'm not, on the pen that I'm holding? What is the difference that I make in these life atoms? Am I helping uplift their evolutionary journey, or am I in some way impeding it? Am I getting them all jangled and jumbled so it's more difficult for them to evolve? So that's really the question that I have, is what influence do I make? What influence do we make on each other? And what influence do we make on everything that is around us? The way that we touch it, you know, the voice that we use, what the inflection, what the, you know, intentionality is behind our voice, behind our thought. And all of the indigenous traditions seem to me to recognize the effect that we have on all life around us. And I think that that is something that we really can take heed from in our modern world, where we seem to have very much lost touch with the fact that everything is alive. We don't have, in many cases, we have no concept whatsoever of the effect that we're having on the matter around us, let alone the plants, the animals, and the other people around us. So it seems that if we were to take heed of some of the indigenous traditions, for example, that do recognize, they even address different life forms as their brothers, their sisters, their, you know, their grandparents, their uncles, their aunts, etc. I even remember St. Francis speaking of brother sun, sister moon, you know, had a deep ancient wisdom coming through him of these interconnections that we all have with each other as sharing this planet and sharing the cosmos on our mutual evolution. So I think I can leave it there as a starting point to this idea of whether or not everything's alive, and this possible use of a term, life atoms.
Thank you, Renee. Very beautiful and well put introduction to this difficult topic. And I particularly like the way that you connected it with indigenous traditions at the end. So we have time now for questions or comments.
Well, I had an aha moment early on when you were referring to this sort of ebb and flow coming into and out of awareness, coming into and out of matter. That science's current creation story is of the Big Bang, right? But in an infinite universe, the Big Bang has been going on, repeatedly exploding and imploding forever, and will continue forever. And it just kind of gave me this whole new perspective on that life as we know it in the bodies that we're in. Having these discussions has happened before in another bang, in a previous Big Bang idea. And every other possible permutation where we are exchanging bodies and having a different topic, for example, and it's an eternal process. Kind of Big Banged my mind. And the notion of particles of life. But you mentioned how, there's not, one is not better than the other, this notion of non-judgment. And then when we talk about the way we are around other people, sometimes people are around me in a way that really jangles me up. And yet it's a life lesson. It's part of my growth. And it might be useful for me to remember when I'm jangling someone else up, even if it's unintentional. The onus is upon us to turn it into a growth experience.
And I think that really points to part of what it means to be inhabiting a human body with a human mind, a human spirit is it is up to us. For example, a dog or a cat that we mistreat doesn't have a lot of choice about their response. They're just going to respond instinctively. And as soon as they see the man with the boots that kicked it, they're going to run the other way as fast as they possibly can. There's no question. That's what they're going to do. Whereas we, having evolved to this human stage, are in that stage where we can make those choices. Just because we got psychologically maybe kicked doesn't mean that we necessarily have to turn and run the other direction. We have a choice as to how we're going to respond.
So Renée, would you say that's a key difference between, say, the animal kingdom and the human kingdom? Is that because the animal is bound by instinctual reaction and life preservation, whereas the human being has that capacity for observation, choice, self-correction, analyzing, actions made in the past, their effects, and it's kind of a self-evolving capacity. Would you say that somehow touches upon the difference between the two kingdoms?
That self-awareness, that ability to see the context in which one is, and then to be aware that we have a choice and to make it. When I read the Theosophical writings, once again, I read about this sliding scale as different animals get higher and higher in their evolution, they get very close to that point where they are coming really close to being self-aware and being able to make choices. It seems as if there are animals that can recognize themselves in the mirror, for example. But an interesting thing that Theosophy proposes is that when we use the term human, we're using a term that can apply across any theater of evolution. So let's say it's in another solar system or another galaxy or whatever. The idea that once these forces of involution of spirit coming into matter and evolution of matter coming out and becoming more conscious and evolving into back into full consciousness of spirit, once those are balanced and there's this place where one has enough self-consciousness that one can make a free choice. That is called the human stage. And it doesn't matter what the human being looks like. Like if there was any reality to Star Trek, anytime any of those creatures that were self-conscious, able to self-direct, make their choices as they were going to live their lives, they would be considered from a theosophical perspective human, no matter what they look like.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that David's comment took me back to this myth that recently was studying that you find in Hinduism. There's probably other forms of it in other traditions, but it's this idea what's called Indra's net. And it's this idea that at the very summit of what we think of as being God or the deity, manifesting deity, there's this infinite web from that point, logoic point, extending out infinitely, and that at every warp and woof intersection of that fabric, there's a diamond, a jewel, and each of those jewels reflects all the other jewels and the net as a whole. And so that potentiality that exists in any place in space exists in every point of space and in every being who's going through this process of evolution. But the other thing that brings to mind is that besides the fact that there's like divinity pervading all, is that it is this inseparable web, right? So that anything that occurs in one part of the web affects the whole web, and David's comment, this idea that when we encounter other individuals or maybe circumstances that throw us, into a whirl, or maybe are very painful, disruptive, etc., that in some sense, that is what we have in the past generated, attracted to ourselves. And so it's coming to us, these are life atoms, right? That are coming into our sphere. And so they're to be, at least from this perspective, as far as I understand it, they're to be welcomed and greeted and treated with compassion, just as every other life atom is. And so that puts a very different perspective on, good karma versus bad karma, right? Because in some sense, it's what we ourselves activated, and it has come to us for nourishment, can provide, that we have to work through, compassionately work through, embrace, understand, and then eventually transcend and transform. So it's just David's comment reminded me of that our karmic circumstances are also life atoms that we've attracted, and that we they're like our children, that we need to take care of them. It's a very different perspective.
Kirk, you remind me, particularly in this neighborhood that Still Moving Center is in, and I'm in here, is this evolutionary process of these old warehouses being torn down and these skyscrapers that are like gems and jewels that people live wonderful lives in. But some people are builders and some people are destroyers. There's a crew that comes in and destroys these old buildings, and it's their nature to tear things apart. We see this reflected also in the fungus kingdom. There's a bifurcation in the fungus. Some of them their job is to take things apart, and others then are to nurture and to connect and to.
We need both, don't we? I mean, if all the old trees that fell in the forest didn't somehow have those, life action things that are disintegrating them, there would be no room for the new trees to grow. Yeah, so we need that change in order for regeneration and new growth to happen.
Yeah, that's the yin yang symbol, right? That's why the dark and the light are both needed for evolution to occur.
Yeah, that makes me think of a few comments back about nature versus nurture. And I've long thought, well, it's nature and nurture, because I think there's elements of both. Yeah, we're not simply a product of our, our genetics, but we're not simply a product of our habits. We're a little bit of a blend of both. But one thing I was really interested in listening to you talk, Renée, is kind of how we perceive something and how we use our senses of perception to kind of understand what is a life atom, and it just had me thinking about here in Hawaii, we believe that rocks are living, and maybe different than many other places in the world, like we have living rocks, like lava emanates from the volcanoes, it moves, it lights, it changes, and when it reaches the sea, it turns into rock. And so there is a very visceral, observable phenomenon that we can see that this rock that looks so inanimate actually has part of its life cycle as a living, breathing, moving state. And so I thought that was really kind of compelling, because we can all see a seed, and how it splits and sends a root, flowers. We see children being born, but these kind of different, there's such a wide variety of ways that people perceive and see. Yeah, just think about microscopes and microbes. So,
Malia, are you the one who told, or maybe it was a guest that you brought, who was leading people up one of our volcanic mountains, and these were non-native people, and somebody picked up a stone and said she was going to take it home with her?
I don't think that's me, but typically, yeah, you don't want to take lava stones with you.
So this particular, it was a kumu, someone trained in traditional Hawaiian knowledge. This kumu said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. So when you take this rock back home with you, how are you going to take care of it?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, this rock, in the summertime is used to being on the side of this volcanic mountain and getting really hot. And so there are times that you're going to need to put your rock into the oven at a low temperature, but so it stays warm enough. And then there are times when this rock that's on this volcanic mountain, but it's kind of near the top, is really experiencing a lot of cold. In fact, snow falls on it. So are you going to be willing to put that rock in your freezer during that period of time so that that rock, gets the right environment that it needs for that time?" And he went through this whole list of things that she was going to need to do to take care of her rock if she was going to take it out of its native place. We don't know whether she ended up taking that rock home or not, but we certainly hope that if she did, she took proper care of it.
Yeah, that story is not familiar, but what a great way to illustrate kind of the responsibility that we have when we change or we move something.
I also like the lava analogy in terms of this whole yin and yang process, because while it is destroying the forest as it's pouring down over the older land, it's also building new land. So it's growth and its destruction all at once.
So Renée, it seems like one of the features, the challenges, one could say, of this teaching is to kind of shift our perspective regarding what we think of as being, mere matter. That involves, everything that we touch, we use, the spaces we live in, et cetera. What's some suggestions you could make as to how to cultivate that perspective instead of seeing, things as inanimate, to gain a greater sense of them being like living, conscious life centers, life atoms, vibrational life atoms that are part of an evolutionary journey, because that's a big jump in awareness, right, and consciousness. I'm just wondering, how would you recommend a person cultivate that perspective?
Well, I think that's a great question to throw out to our participants here in this conversation. What experience do you have of just having a sense that something actually has a life or a soul, or I'm not sure how you think about it, but that it makes a difference how you handle, how you treat that something?
When I was young, one of my jobs was to do the vacuuming at our house. And I couldn't stand the noise that a vacuum made. It seemed almost like something that was all tangled up with this cord, and I trip on the cord and it was never in the right place. And the vacuum made all this noise and it huffed dust. And I used to get really upset at the vacuum cleaner. And at some point, it only got worse and worse. Every time I would use it, it would get worse and I would get angrier. And I'm talking about being, 10, 12 years old or something like that. But, after a short while of having that attitude, I realized that the fact that it was getting worse was something that I was doing to that vacuum cleaner. And I didn't know anything about, theosophical ideas or life atoms or anything like that. But it was very clear to me that I was doing something to the elements in that machine that was causing it to rebel. And when I stopped, I consciously stopped doing it as a kid, and it stopped. It's like that vacuum cleaner became my friend. I don't exactly know how to explain it, except that it wasn't like, okay, all of a sudden I stopped being angry at it, and then I wouldn't trip in the cord, because it was like a relationship, or a reciprocal relationship with this machine, and it stopped rebelling when I stopped being angry at it. Something I'll never forget.
I love that story.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. And you were the one who had to make the choice, not the vacuum cleaner. It just responded back to you the way you were giving it out to.
Exactly. I knew very clearly that I was the prime mover here. I was the cause of all this distress. And I actually kind of knew that I was distressing it, whatever it was. I could sense that somehow, although I couldn't explain it in ways that you could explain it with, these beautiful ideas about life atoms and that sort of thing. But then later on, when I started becoming interested in Native American studies, stories were just amazing. If you read stories about stones, about rocks, they hold memories. That seems to be throughout the indigenous communities, that stones are a receptacle almost for impressing memories, and they hold memories.
In answer to Kirk's question about how one cultivates that, I think in child rearing, right, you at some point when they're old enough to be able to care for it, you give them a pet so that they see the results of their care and their nurturance and how it helps something develop. Well, my pets just happen to be plants. And I had an experience just recently, and I'll share it with you since it's right here. So this little monster started off really quite tiny, and literally it's a monstera, and it started getting, the branches started getting so long that it started to like wander over the pod and become sort of ungainly, and I kept thinking, you know, maybe it doesn't belong here anymore. And literally within a week or two, the leaves started to curl and kind of get a little yellowing to them. And so we've been having different conversations lately about its sense of belonging, and sort of returning my appreciation for what it is. We're changing the conversation, changing the energy around it.
Wants to be with you.
Then you look as if you've had similar kinds of experiences.
No, I was just thinking about, have you ever seen that movie, The Secret of Water? And about intentions and how the energy you send out can affect those around you. And when he said that story, it just kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? But yeah.
You know, when you drive your car right after washing it, it's a totally different experience. You can feel the car is happier, you know, it's quieter, it's smoother. You know, particularly if you take the time to wax the exterior and clean the interior, it's just a whole different experience. You've changed the atoms of that whole system, and you can feel it.
It's true. We all had that experience, right? Why is my suddenly the car is running smoother? All I did was wash it. How can that have an effect? It reminds me also of something I read long ago. I think it was in the writings of Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was an archaeologist and curator of the Boston Museum of Fine Art and studied ancient civilizations. And he was talking about the importance of order and cleanliness in a home and in a community. You know, so we think of the process of tidying up and clearing up and so on as being, you know, sort of like a mechanical chore that one needs to get through. But that actually that's part of our, in this context, would be part of our taking care of, proper care for those elemental lives, life atoms that are part of our circle of duties and dharmas, you know. But that he also mentions this idea in relation to the city, that once the proper ordering of the city is in alignment, that then wisdom can blossom, and that without that kind of everything sort of being in its place and in ordered and orderly, that wisdom can't really manifest properly. I mean, I don't know on a deeper, you know, metaphysical level if that's always true, but it somehow it struck a chord. And then also he said that that one of the features of a high level of civilization, very evolved civilization, like you find in ancient India and is described by Plato, is that everyone has their sense of fulfilling their dharma, no matter what level of society they happen to be in, whether it's the trash collector or the street sweeper or window washer, that they all have the sense that what they're doing is contributing to the benefit of the whole. And it's not, none of it is demeaning. None of it is lesser or greater. It's all the dharma that has come to you inescapably. And that's what makes that sense of everyone contributing to, you know, a kind of unified field that gives, that's where wisdom again can manifest.
Sounds as though even David's plant needs to know that it has a place in his home, that it's fulfilling a purpose so that it will thrive and shine and take its place where it belongs. Yeah. Mary, what's your experience?
There are a number of thoughts that I had throughout this conversation. I'm thinking of the Bible when Lot's wife was turned to salt. So that's, from one form to another form. And the Hawaiian culture, a lot of images of people, even the animals. We have mo'o, which is a lizard. They were all shapes and sizes. So we had giant mo'o, and they may have been benevolent and they may have not. And I recall one quote legend about a mo'o that turned into a rock. And when people passed by, they didn't know it was an actual lizard, and it would attack them. After they've gotten to certain area, they would turn into the lizard again and attack the people. And then I'm pretty sure that there was a hero who killed the mo'o and it turned permanently into a rock. And then we had an incident here at our house in Kaimuki. Dave, my husband, he smokes, so he stays outside, and he's got a canopy over it, and he's got a structure he made. And we've got mango trees throughout our property because my mother loved mangoes. And there was a biggish rock. I probably, oh my goodness, I don't know how many pounds, but it was a good size boulder. And Dave wanted to move it because it was kind of blocking access, and he would try shoving it. He would try lifting it with a pike, or trying to move it, and it just would not budge. And this had been going on for maybe 6, 7, 8 months. And finally he decided to talk to it. And he said, you're such a beautiful rock. I would love to move you just a few, just a little ways over. And then when the sun comes up in the morning, you will get this beautiful warmth. You will be greeting the sun. And he talked to the rock, and then he moved it, and it moved like butter. And there's, how does that happen? But we've, in my understanding, we're all connected. From dust we came, and to dust we will return. So it's all important, and we all need to respect it. And sometimes, well, I'd say a lot of times, if the parents don't teach their kids, how are they going to know? And thank goodness we have, at least in Hawaii, we have classes for the kids in culture. So they get an introduction, and then they can ask more questions. And with the proliferation of databases that kids can access and adults can access, we can learn more things. But this has been a very interesting topic. Thank you, Renee. Amen.
Great comment, Mary. Thank you for that story. It's a great illustration.
Indeed. How about Sharon or Carolyn?
Well, I'm listening. Oh, I'm here.
Do you have any real life experiences of it becoming evident to you that perhaps things around you actually are alive and responsive to what we do?
I think there's a lot of exploring of the astral vestiges you have to do.
Well, I haven't even begun to get into that. That's a whole different realm of things. But I think when you say that, you are talking about kind of like the idea that anything that's in the physical world, since everything is on a sliding scale between matter and spirit or consciousness, there's something more ethereal, more of an invisible pattern that our physical, whatever it is built upon. And when I hear you talk about that, that's what I'm getting.
Well, it's all very complex. There's no doubt about that.
It does seem, David, going back to your initial comment about, universes or cosmoses coming into existence and then withdrawing from them and coming back in again. If we are talking about an evolutionary process, every time that the cosmos comes back into existence, it seems that, and this would be consistent with theosophical teachings, that it comes back at a somewhat higher level. So even in that respect, in that regard, there's this evolutionary process of continual learning, continual uplifting. And we've all heard that phrase, as above, so below. So if that's how things work in the cosmos, if that makes sense to us, something analogous must be happening to us. And
That's a great point to close on. And we need a volunteer to give us a vote of thanks for Renée's presentation and commentary today.
So let me take a whack at just how much love and just beautiful feelings. Renée, your whole life seems to be dedicated to nurturing and uplifting people. And this presentation is no exception to that. Beautifully presented and great thoughts. You left me chewing on this idea that sort of the output of the evolutionary process is more choice. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation and stimulating us into some very interesting thoughts.
thank you so much. And I also wanted to particularly thank Kirk Gradine for taking on the role as host. And I was really hoping and delighted to know that he was able to fill in the gaps for me in our conversation today. He's a brilliant speaker himself. He has spoken to us at GEMS on many occasions, and we look forward to him filling that role again. And thank all of you so much.